Now to the war in Ukraine, which is on the agenda at a meeting of EU defense ministers today. Ahead of the Brussels meeting, Germany's defense minister Boris Pistorius acknowledged that the EU would not be able to meet its goal of supplying Kyiv with 1 million rounds of ammunition by next March. He added that EU countries were working with industry to ramp up production. Now, one of the world's leading ammunition manufacturers is located in the Norwegian town of Raufoss, where DW's Terry Schultz got a look at some of the problems that are plaguing production.
The challenges of weapons manufacturing may have come as an unpleasant surprise for politicians who promised Ukraine 1 million rounds of ammunition by next March.
It's not so that you can just drive a truck up to a defense company and just tell them how much you want and leave the same day. It's not like that.
Norway's Nammo is one of the world's leading suppliers of ammunition, with 27 manufacturing facilities across a dozen countries.
These steel tubes, still hot from the forging process, will become some of those coveted 155mm shells here at Nammo's Raufoss manufacturing facility. But what producers explain is that they can't fill orders they haven't received. And so the responsibility for this dramatic scale-up in output being expected doesn't start here.
While the number of contracts for ammunition has increased, that alone isn't enough to boost production to the levels that are needed. There are other obstacles hindering large-scale orders and joint procurement. For example, while NATO countries primarily use 155mm caliber guns and ammunition, there are 14 variations of these artillery shells because each country produces them with slight differences. Some industry leaders are calling for the standardization of defense products, even though these different specifications are seen as favoring manufacturers. But the CEO of Finland's Patria Group, Esa Rautalinko, says those days should be over.
The market is very protectionist, not just in Europe. I think it's a global phenomenon. And what the industry needs to realize is that if we are just sub-optimizing our own production capabilities, so things will not change fast enough. If we have different equipment that are not standardized enough, it means that it's a logistical nightmare.
NATO's top military official urges more cohesion at the political level, so supplies get to where they're needed at the tactical level.
We have to agree that we have to stop doing that, because a soldier in the field is not interested whether the artillery round comes from factory A, B or C in whatever country. They don't care. They just want the ammunition to be able to hit the target.
Nammo says it has more than tripled production in some areas over the last 2 years, and it's expanding its facilities. But what happens if demand drops dramatically after the end of the war in Ukraine? Nammo CEO Morten Brandtzæg is suggesting 10 to 15-year production contracts to deal with such future uncertainty.
I think we have to share the risk, because it's also very important that these defense companies, that they are kind of profitable and that we can reinvest in R&D.
Brandtzæg won't offer a prediction on whether there's any way some 700,000 more rounds of ammunition can be sent to Ukraine by March. He'll only say it will take his company much longer than that just to fill the orders it already has.
So as we've heard, EU defense ministers meeting today in Brussels to discuss military aid for Ukraine. DW's Brussels Bureau Chief Alexandra von Namen is there for us. Alexandra, we just heard in our report there that Europe's arms manufacturers are worried about whether the EU is ready to commit to long-term military support for Ukraine. How united is the EU here on Ukraine?
Well, the vast majority of member states in the European Union are saying that they are willing and determined to ramp up ammunition production and arms production in their countries. The German defense minister told us that Germany is already doing that. The Dutch defense minister told us here in Brussels today that they are doing that as well. And actually, she called on the industry to step up their game. But the problem is, of course, that Europe didn't anticipate a war at its doorstep, and the whole process of production is not advancing quickly enough for Ukraine, with far-reaching consequences. The European Union, as we have just heard in the report, has promised Ukraine to provide them with 1 million artillery shells until next March. And we heard today from the German defense minister, Boris Pistorius, telling us that this goal is very unrealistic, that is unrealistic to expect this goal to be achieved. So that is quite embarrassing for the European Union to promise those artillery shells to Ukraine and then not being able to deliver. And with regard to unity, we also have to say that there is specifically one member state that is still blocking military aid to Ukraine, and this is Hungary, that is blocking the next tranche of military assistance, 500 million euros to Ukraine.
And now the attention has been turning to the Israel-Gaza war. Has that in any way changed EU priorities?
Well, I think that the Ukrainian government is very worried that the war in the Middle East could distract the West's attention and divert the Western support away from Kiev. However, what we have heard here in Brussels is that all member states are saying this is not going to happen. We are still determined to continue our support for Ukraine, even though some of them, for instance, Germany has also promised Israel to support them with military assistance. But we have to say that Europe is not a big player in the Middle East, and it is rather the US, and that they will need to deal with both the war in Ukraine and the war in the Middle East with regard to their military assistance.
Well, thank you very much for that update. That's DW's Alexandra van Namen in Brussels.